U.S. President Donald Trump says he has struck his biggest trade deal yet.
To U.S. President Donald Trump's latest round of tariffs. While countries like Canada say they're working to negotiate better trade deals with the U.S. president, Trump is doubling down on the use of tariffs as a way to boost the U.S. economy.
A single midnight post sent shockwaves through one of the closest alliances in the world. Not from a diplomat, not from a policy paper, but from the fingertips of the U.S. president himself. Canada's position makes any trade agreement nearly impossible. That was it. No context, no nuance, just a blunt statement, crafted for spectacle more than negotiation. It was aimed at Ottawa, but the message wasn't really about Canada. It was a performance for the world stage. The White House wanted to show it could still command loyalty, or punish defiance, and Canada, America's neighbor and top trading partner, was cast as the example. But here's the mystery. Why Canada? Why now? Other allies had taken similar positions on global issues without a single threat. London wasn't punished. Paris wasn't punished. Mexico City wasn't punished. So why was Ottawa singled out? The answer, as we'll uncover, has less to do with trade itself and far more to do with sovereignty, strategy, and the personal politics of power. And the response coming from Ottawa could change everything, but will it be enough? Stay with me. The first chalk on the surface. The issue was tariffs. A tool President Trump wielded loudly, framing them as leverage to defend American workers. He promised they would pressure partners into concessions. Factories would roar back to life. Jobs would flow home. But behind the slogans, Canada knew something different. Tariffs were blunt weapons. They damaged both sides, disrupted supply chains, and weakened investor confidence. So when Trump blasted his message into the night, Ottawa faced a choice: bend quickly under pressure or resist and risk escalation. For decades, Canada had played the role of loyal partner. Disagreements existed, of course, but they were usually resolved quietly at the negotiating table. This time, the stage was different. The dispute wasn't happening in the privacy of trade talks. It was unfolding in real time, in front of the cameras, with millions watching. And that stage made every move more dangerous. Enter the counterweight while the headlines focused on tariffs. A quieter figure began shaping Canada's response. Mark Carney, known internationally as a steady hand in finance. Carney's strategy wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. He understood something fundamental, that sovereignty, once surrendered, rarely returns. So instead of scrambling to appease Washington, Canada began to prepare for the long haul. Diversification of trade, investment in domestic industries, legal protections embedded in agreements that would make tariff threats less effective. It was a different kind of playbook, less about reacting to Trump's words, more about building an economic shield strong enough to withstand them. But the White House underestimated this approach. Officials there believed Canada couldn't hold out. That pressure alone, applied often enough and loudly enough, would force Ottawa to the table. Yet Carney and his allies weren't rushing. They were building resilience step by step, quietly but effectively. Why it mattered: this wasn't just about steel or aluminum or even agriculture. It was about precedent. If Canada folded here, what message would that send? That America could dictate terms not just in trade, but in foreign policy. That sovereignty itself could be leveraged in exchange for economic relief. That was the deeper game, and the reason Ottawa couldn't simply yield. Meanwhile, Trump doubled down, accusing Canada of exploiting American farmers, inflating numbers about subsidies, even implying that U.S. military protection gave him the right to dictate economic policy north of the border. For Washington, sovereignty was being framed as a privilege, not a right, and that's where the standoff truly began to escalate. The stakes rise, markets reacted, investors worried, business leaders in both countries watched EMSCOs nervously as rhetoric grew sharper. But the numbers told a revealing story. U.S. job growth began missing expectations. Revisions quietly erased hundreds of thousands of positions from earlier reports. Analysts pointed directly to uncertainty caused by tariffs. Still, Trump insisted the data was wrong, that statisticians were that the real economy was thriving. When a leader begins attacking the scoreboard instead of the game itself, it signals something deeper. In security, Canada saw that vulnerability, and instead of panicking, Ottawa stayed calm, reinforcing its base at home while quietly cultivating new partners abroad. The battle was no longer just about tariffs. It was about endurance. Which side could last longer without blinking? An open question. As this clash deepened, one truth became clear. Trump's style relied on speed, shock, and escalation. Carney's strategy relied on patience, preparation, and resilience. It was a duel of opposites, fire versus stone. But in a contest like this, who really holds the stronger hand? Was Canada's resistance a calculated defense of independence, or a dangerous gamble against a far more powerful neighbor? That's the puzzle we're going to unravel, because what started as a trade spat is now shaping the future of North American politics, building Canada's shield. By the time Trump's threats filled the headlines, Ottawa had already begun laying the groundwork for something bigger, not a flashy counterpunch, not a retaliatory tariff list to make the evening news, but a deeper strategy designed to do something far more important: remove Washington's leverage. Because Carney and Canadian officials understood a brutal truth about trade wars. The winner isn't the one who shouts the loudest. It's the one who can outlast the storm. The quiet preparation. Canada's first move was simple but powerful. Reinforce industries at home. Steel, aluminum, advanced manufacturing sectors most exposed to U.S. pressure began receiving targeted investment. The message was subtle but clear. Canada wouldn't be caught flat-footed. At the same time, Ottawa began accelerating trade diversification. New markets in Europe and Asia were quietly cultivated. Deals were signed. Opportunities expanded. The idea wasn't retaliation for its own sake, it was resilience. If Washington slammed one door shut, Ottawa wanted 5 others already open. This approach didn't generate dramatic headlines. There were no fiery press conferences or bold declarations. Instead, it unfolded almost invisibly, week by week, policy by policy. But that slow build was exactly the point. The stronger Canada's base became, the weaker Trump's leverage appeared. Legal armor, but economic strength alone wasn't enough. Canada also needed legal protection. That came from the Modernized Trade Agreement, the CUSMA, or USMCA, as it's called in the United States. Built into its clauses were safeguards, covering nearly 90% of Canadian exports to the U.S. Rules of origin, tariff exemptions, and dispute mechanisms all acted like guardrails, preventing sudden shocks from collapsing entire sectors. Here's the twist. Trump himself had once championed this very agreement as a victory. Yet the fine print, negotiated with quiet persistence, insulated Canada in ways the White House seemed to overlook. So when new threats were launched, many were already blunted before they even hit. What looked like a weapon in Washington was, in practice, little more than theater. A battle of styles. This is where the contrast between Trump and Carney grew. Trump's playbook was rooted in speed and surprise. Announce something at midnight. Dominate the news cycle. Force the other side to scramble. Carney's playbook was the opposite. Don't react to every headline. Don't play into the drama. Instead, build structural strength so the drama no longer matters. It was noise versus endurance. Chaos versus patience. And the more Canada refused to break, the more Trump's tactics began to look like bluster. The human cost. But while strategies clashed, people felt the consequences. In the United States, factories hesitated to hire. Businesses held back on investments. Families in agricultural states began to feel squeezed as overseas buyers shifted to other suppliers. Each week of uncertainty added pressure, and markets which once celebrated the promise of tariff leverage started to question it. Meanwhile, in Canada, industries began adjusting. Pain was still real, but it was absorbed differently because Ottawa had prepared. Diversification softened the blow. Investors noticed. Confidence grew. For every threat Trump issued, Canada responded not with panic but with quiet reinforcement, and that steadiness carried weight. The turning point. By mid-year, cracks were visible. US job reports came in far weaker than expected. Revisions slashed earlier gains. And suddenly, the story wasn't about Canada folding under pressure. It was about whether Washington's strategy was backfiring. When Trump accused government statisticians of manipulating the numbers, it revealed more than just frustration. It signaled that reality was slipping out of his control, and Ottawa knew it. For Canadian officials, the longer they could hold the line, the more time worked in their favor. Every delayed concession proved resilience. Every day the White House escalated without results, Canada's credibility strengthened. Sovereignty. As a muscle inside Ottawa, one phrase began to circulate. Sovereignty is a muscle. Use it or lose it. This wasn't just a fight over tariffs. It was a defense of independence itself. If Canada yielded here, it wouldn't just set economic terms. It would set a precedent that foreign policy and sovereignty could be bargained, a way that wasn't acceptable. So standing firm became more than policy. It became principle. And that's where the real standoff began. Not about numbers on a trade sheet, but about whether a nation could be pressured into abandoning its own voice. A cliffhanger unfolds. By now, the confrontation looked less like negotiation and more like a test of endurance. Trump relied on escalation. Canada relied on preparation. But here's the question. When one side thrives on chaos and the other on patience, who blinks first? And more importantly, what happens when outside players, like Europe and Asia, start noticing Canada's calm and signaling interest in closer ties? Because that shift doesn't just blunt American pressure. It changes the balance of power, and that's exactly what was beginning to happen. The world starts watching. By the time the U.S. job numbers came in weaker than expected, something subtle but profound was already shifting. The confrontation wasn't just a North American standoff anymore. It was becoming a global story. The global echo from Brussels to Tokyo. Leaders were watching how Canada held its ground. The European Union had already signed the CETA deal with Ottawa, giving Canadian exporters broad access to European markets. Suddenly, that deal wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was a lifeline. Buyers who once looked almost exclusively to the U.S. began reconsidering. Why depend on Washington's unpredictable trade policies when Canada was offering stable, rules-based access? In Asia, the story was similar. The CPTPP agreement, a vast Pacific trade pact, gave Canadian goods preferential access to markets stretching from Vietnam to Australia. While Trump pulled the U.S. out of multilateral agreements, Canada leaned in. And that contrast mattered, because every time Washington raised new tariff threats, Canada had another partner willing to step closer. The theater in Washington in the United States, the trade war increasingly looked like political theater. Headlines roared with every new announcement. Tariff threats, counter-threats, midnight tweets. But on the ground, industries weren't celebrating. Automakers faced higher input costs. Farmers faced shrinking overseas demand. Small businesses hesitated to expand, afraid that tomorrow's rules could change with a single press conference. The irony was hard to ignore. Trump's strategy, meant to display American strength, was starting to highlight American fragility. And Canada, once painted as the vulnerable neighbor, was quietly flipping the script. Carney's calculated comp through all this. Mark Carney remained consistent. No dramatic speeches. No inflammatory, just calm explanations of structural stability. He reminded Canadians that markets reward predictability, that confidence isn't built through noise, but through trust. And every time he spoke, he sent a message beyond Canada's borders. This is a country you can do business with, no matter the turbulence elsewhere. It was central banking as diplomacy, policy as reassurance, and it worked. Foreign investors, nervous about volatility in the United States, began exploring Canadian options. The Toronto Stock Exchange saw renewed interest. Real estate markets held steady. And here's the twist. The more outsiders invested in Canada, the harder it became for Washington's threats to destabilize it. Because now, stability wasn't just a national asset, it was an international expectation. The pressure cooker inside the White House, frustration mounted. Trump's team wanted results. Tariffs were supposed to bring Canada to the table, pen in hand, ready to concede. Instead, Ottawa was holding firm, quietly expanding its alliances, and letting time do the heavy lifting. Trump escalated the rhetoric. Accusations flew, claims of unfairness, betrayal, manipulation, but each time the volume rose, markets seemed to roll their eyes a little more, and in the background Carney's patience turned into leverage, because the longer Canada stayed the course, the more global sympathy tilted in its favor. The human signal, one of the most telling signs, came not from boardrooms or trading floors, but from people. Farmers in Iowa, steelworkers in Pennsylvania, small-town manufacturers in Ohio, many of them loyal Trump supporters, began voicing unease. Not about Canada, not about Ottawa's policies, but about whether Washington's strategy was actually helping them. When hometown newspapers started running stories on lost contracts, delayed shipments, and anxious families, the political cost of the trade war became impossible to ignore. It wasn't Canada that looked cornered, it was Trump, Canada's quiet win. And here lies the irony. Canada wasn't trying to win in the way Washington defined victory. There was no grand press conference declaring dominance, no chest thumping about concessions forced. Instead, victory came in the form of survival, in resilience, in proving that a smaller nation, often underestimated, could resist pressure not by fighting fire with fire, but by standing firm with quiet confidence. That was the lesson observers began repeating. Trump's tactics might bend weak systems, but they couldn't easily break a country prepared to endure the bigger stakes. But here's where the stakes grew even larger, because this wasn't just about Canada anymore. If Ottawa could hold out against Trump's pressure, what message would that send to others? To Europe, resisting U.S. tariffs on cars. To Asia, navigating American demands on technology and supply chains. To allies everywhere, wondering whether Washington's threats were as powerful as they sounded. The ripple effect was enormous. If Canada could stand firm, others could too. And that realization, more than any single tariff or job report, began to reshape the global conversation. A new question. So the story wasn't just about whether Canada would break. The real question became, if Trump's threats couldn't bend Canada, then who could they bend at all? And if the world started to see the limits of U.S. leverage, what would that mean for America's role on the global stage? That's the cliffhanger Ottawa quietly left hanging. Because, while Trump fought for a headline victory, Canada was building something more lasting. Credibility, and credibility, once earned, is far harder to take away. The cracks begin to show at first. The strategy looked bold. Tariffs on steel and aluminum. Threats against dairy. Talk of ripping up NAFTA entirely. It was dramatic. It was loud. And for a few weeks, it dominated headlines. But headlines don't build stability. And stability is what markets demand. The market's verdict by mid-year, volatility on Wall Street was spiking. One week, optimism over a possible deal. The next, fear of a breakdown. Investors were whiplashed by uncertainty. American manufacturers raised alarms. Input costs were rising. Contracts were stalling. And global partners were quietly shopping elsewhere. And in a cruel twist, many of the hardest hit regions were the same places that had cheered Trump's hardline stance in the first place. The farmer in Iowa, who suddenly couldn't sell soybeans abroad. The auto plant in Michigan, wondering how long supply chains could hold. The small business in Ohio paying more for imported machinery. One by one, the stories piled up. Markets began to whisper the word no White House wanted to hear. Recession. Ottawa's patience in contrast. Canada's strategy was slow, deliberate, almost boring by comparison. There were no dramatic ultimatums, no erratic policy shifts. Instead, Ottawa played the long game. Diversify markets. Offer targeted support at home. Keep communication steady. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't grab global headlines. But it worked. While Washington wrestled with its own turbulence, Canada was quietly proving the power of predictability. And the more Carney emphasized stability, the more it highlighted the chaos south of the border. border. The political cost in Washington for Trump. The political cost was mounting. Supporters wanted quick wins, not prolonged stalemates. Farmers demanded bailouts to cover lost income. Business leaders warned of supply chain collapses. Every Oval Office meeting seemed to end with the same question: where's the victory? But the victory never came, because Canada wasn't folding. And this wasn't just a trade fight anymore. It was a test of credibility. The narrative flip here's where the real shift occurred. What started as a story of U.S. strength and Canadian vulnerability flipped into the opposite. International media began portraying Canada as the steady hand, the resilient underdog refusing to bow. Trump, on the other hand, was cast as the unpredictable gambler, whose tactics were starting to backfire. For a president who thrived on projecting dominance, that reversal was devastating. The harder he pushed, the more it looked like he was losing control. Carney's shadow strategy. Through it all, Carney's shadow loomed large, not through grand gestures, but through subtleties. Each measured statement reinforced trust. Each policy adjustment reassured markets. Each calm response contrasted Trump's volatility. It was a masterclass in how to win without fighting. Because, while Trump shouted about deals and dominance, Carney and Ottawa showed that credibility could be more powerful than noise. The breaking point came not with a single moment, but with accumulation. A series of reports revealed growing strain on American households, rising costs, shrinking exports, delayed projects. Suddenly, the trade war wasn't an abstract political chess match. It was dinner-table reality. And when that reality hit home, Trump's strongest argument, that he was protecting American workers, began to ring hollow. Poll numbers slipped. Confidence wavered. Allies hesitated. Meanwhile, Canada's steady course gave it something invaluable. Time. Time for new trade deals to take root. Time for domestic industries to adjust. Time for investors to regain confidence. Trump wanted quick submission. Instead, he found himself in a slow bleed. The global lesson the world was watching. Leaders in Europe, Asia, and beyond took note. Trump's high-stakes tactics weren't invincible. If Canada, a smaller, trade-dependent neighbor, could weather the storm, then others could too. And that realization had consequences far beyond Ottawa or Washington. It reshaped global diplomacy. It emboldened nations facing similar pressure. It forced capitals from Berlin to Tokyo to reconsider how they dealt with U.S. demands. The more Canada held, the more Trump's aura of inevitability faded. The quiet irony, and here lies the quiet irony. Trump's trade war, designed to showcase American dominance, ended up showcasing Canadian resilience. Instead of proving the U.S. could bend allies at will, it proved something different, that pressure without partnership has limits. And in that lesson was the seed of something even bigger, the erosion of America's leverage. The stage for the finale. By the end of the year, the question wasn't whether Canada could survive. It was clear that it could. The real question was what came next. Would Washington double down, risking further damage at home, or would it search for an off-ramp, a way to claim victory without admitting defeat? And in that uncertainty, Canada had already secured the most important prize, credibility in the eyes of the world. Because when the cracks began to show in Washington's strategy, Ottawa didn't just hold the line. It set a new standard for how smaller nations could push back against global giants. The underdog's victory. By the time the dust began to settle, the scoreboard didn't look anything like Washington had imagined. The tariffs that were meant to cripple Canada hadn't broken its resolve. The shock that was supposed to send Ottawa scrambling had instead sparked reinvention. And the story that began as one of American strength versus Canadian vulnerability had flipped into something entirely different, a lesson in resilience, strategy, and the quiet power of patience. Canada's transformation. What began as a survival response turned into transformation. Agriculture, once dangerously dependent on a single customer, had diversified. Canadian farmers now had footholds in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Manufacturing, once threatened by tariffs, had found new efficiencies through innovation and automation. And energy, always a cornerstone of the Canadian economy, had drawn fresh investment from partners eager to hedge against us unpredictability. In short, Canada wasn't weaker. It was stronger, not because it avoided hardship, but because it endured it and adapted. That transformation wasn't just economic. It was psychological. A nation often cast as the polite junior partner had discovered its own leverage, its own ability to say no. And that shift, subtle but profound, would echo for years to come. Washington's unfinished fight for Trump. The ending wasn't nearly as clean. The White House could, and did, claim victories. New trade language in USMCA, concessions on certain sectors, headlines that trumpeted toughness. But beneath those claims, the fractures remained. Farm bailouts ballooned into the tens of billions. Manufacturers, warned of long-term competitiveness losses, and allies, once wary of crossing Washington, began to see that defiance was possible. The fight wasn't a total defeat for the U.S., but it wasn't the resounding victory Trump promised. It was instead a draw. And in a battle of reputations, a draw can feel like a loss. The global ripple effect. The implications reached far beyond North America. In Europe, leaders whispered about the Canadian model, staying firm, diversifying trade, and waiting out US pressure. In Asia, smaller economies studied Ottawa's response, recognizing that even without the raw size of the U.S., credibility and patience could level the playing field. And in Washington, policymakers faced a new reality. Tariffs and threats alone weren't enough. The ripple effect was clear. The age of uncontested American economic leverage was fading. Not gone, not irrelevant, but no longer absolute. Carney's final lesson at the center of it all. One man's influence stood out. Mark Carney, the quiet architect of stability. He never held rallies. He never fired off late-night threats on social media. He didn't dominate news cycles, but his steady hand helped steer Canada through the storm. Every policy shift, every calm explanation, every reminder that Canada could endure, all of it built trust where panic could have taken hold. And in doing so, Carney offered a final lasting lesson. Leadership isn't always about noise. Sometimes, it's about silence, discipline, and the ability to project calm in chaos. A different kind of power. That lesson matters, because power in the 21st century isn't only measured in weapons or GDP. It's also measured in resilience, in credibility, in the ability to withstand shocks without collapsing. And in that sense, Canada proved something extraordinary. It proved that smaller nations aren't helpless in the face of global giants. It proved that adaptability can be stronger than aggression. And it proved that patience, when wielded correctly, is a weapon all its own. The closing irony. Here's the irony history will remember. Trump wanted to make an example out of Canada, to show the world what happens when allies push back. Instead, Canada made an example out of him by refusing to fold, by adapting instead of panicking. Ottawa flipped the script. The world didn't see a giant disciplining its neighbor. It saw an underdog standing firm and winning in the long run. The lasting question. And so, years later, the trade war is remembered less for the tariffs themselves and more for the questions it raised. Can brute economic force still dictate global outcomes? Or has the balance shifted toward resilience, alliances, and credibility? Trump's approach reveal us strength or expose its limits? Those questions remain unanswered, but one truth is clear. Canada, the supposed victim, walked away stronger. Final reflection. In the end, this wasn't just a story about steel or soybeans. It wasn't just about tariffs or treaties. It was about the clash between noise and discipline, between force and patience, between a president determined to bend the world and a neighbor determined not to break. And when the history books are written, they may not remember every percentage point or policy detail, but they will remember the arc. A trade war that began as a gamble of dominance ended as a story of resilience. And in that story, Canada didn't just survive. It proved that sometimes the quietest player can change the game entirely. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to get notified our latest updates.